the other programs at the Wilson Center who have co-organized this with us, which includes the Africa program, the Environmental Change and Security program, the Comparative Urban Studies project, and the program on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy. During this session, we have 3 speakers here who will weigh in on from a regional perspective on the global trend of overseas farmland investments in Asia, Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union states. Our first speaker is Raul Montemayor. He is the national manager of the Federation of Free Farmers Cooperatives, Inc. in the Philippines. He also manages the head office activities of FFFCI's mother organization, the Federation of Agricultural Producers. He is also a private sector advisor to the Philippine government in the World Trade Organization and a board member of the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council.
Okay, good morning to everybody. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit sleepy, but it's midnight in our country right now, so I'll try to wake myself up. But anyway, as Sue said, I represent the farmers organization in the Philippines and an international network. So my short presentation today will be more on the farmers' perspective on this issue, and also a little bit more on Asia in particular. So this is just an outline, very similar to the presentations that came earlier. And in my introduction, I just wanted to note that this phenomenon of foreigners investing in agricultural ventures overseas and in the process acquiring or leasing lands is not exactly new. In my country, for example, we still have some of the plantations that were set up by Spanish people during the colonial period. And then we already had people talking about the major drivers of farmland investment, so I don't want to dwell too long on this topic. Maybe just to summarize, I think up to now the biggest stimulator has been still the business and profit motive. And here globalization has played a major role. Not only has it expanded markets, but it has also made it possible to locate your production, your processing and other operations in various parts of the world where you can find better tariffs, lower labor costs, cheaper power, and other better conditions for business. And freer trade has also stimulated more competition among global players. So agribusiness firms have been taking steps to secure their access to raw materials at the cheapest and most reliable way, and in the process, get farmland investments or go into farmland investments. The recent spike in overseas farmland investments is due to some new factors, one of which is we mentioned is food security concerns. We all remember the food crisis last year, and for us rice eaters in Asia, it was a rude wake-up call. Now governments are talking again about food self-sufficiency and saying that we cannot just rely on our trading partners to supply us food during emergencies. Some countries, however, do not have enough capacity to produce their food at home, so they look for farmlands elsewhere to grow what they need. Climate change and warnings about the future availability of water are further fueling this kind of thinking. Related to this are food safety concerns, which have led some countries like Japan to produce products abroad at a cheaper price and re-export them back home, but under very strict sanitary conditions. There is, of course, the biofuel craze, but with oil prices going down now, some people are saying it's a biofuels proposition. But there are still countries which are serious about their long-term energy security and are willing to invest in alternative fuel sources. Using lands in other countries to produce biofuel feedstock might be politically expedient to avoid food versus fuel debates at home. It goes without saying that many governments in the developing countries are actually welcoming and providing incentives for these foreign farmland investments to come in. And to them, it means more money in the economy, more taxes, more jobs, etc. And it is also not surprising if there are behind-the-scene deals and sweeteners, such as promises of official development assistance or oil supply guarantees. I heard, for example, another perspective. A lot of the Japanese investments are actually geopolitically motivated. They are trying to offset the influence of China in certain regions or to equal the influence of China. So they are also going into things that China does. So many motivations for these farmland investments. The modes by which foreign investors acquire lands in other countries is quite well known. What is notable are two things. First, governments often proactively attract such investors, especially in Asia, by forming state entities that can lease the lands directly to the foreign investors and even go through extra lengths to facilitate their entry. Secondly, in Asia again, foreign ownership of land is usually not allowed or strictly limited. In countries like the Philippines, there are even land reform and land redistribution programs which prevent small landowners from selling or even leasing lands to other parties. So it's an additional constraint. So in most countries, these foreign investors tie up with local partners or form a locally registered joint venture that has more easy access to lands and other investment privileges. I have looked at some of the current leases, and they are usually 30 years, renewable for another 30 years, oftentimes at the option of the investor. And these are usually for long gestation crops like banana, pineapple, palm oil, or long-term ventures. Another evolving system is contract growing, where the landowner nominally retains ownership and control over his land but agrees to follow farm management and cultivation practices imposed by the firm. Then you have the combinations or hybrids. Let me focus on the issues and concerns regarding this farmland investment phenomenon. I would like to start by saying that there is nothing inherently wrong or bad with foreign investments coming in and embarking on agribusiness ventures. As mentioned earlier, they provide much needed capital, they bring new technologies, create jobs, and generate tax revenues. Because most of these investments are in the rural areas, they can have economic multiplier effects, which can spill over into improved education, health, peace and order, and other benefits. Many people also argue that farmers are better off leasing their lands and getting jobs elsewhere instead of staying on as marginal subsistence farmers. But our experience has shown that there is a good way to undertake these investments, and there are modes which tend to create more harm than good. Firstly, there is the danger mentioned earlier of farmers being indiscriminately displaced from their farms, which is understandable because investors will tend to target lands that are already cleared and ready to be planted. But even in forestal or logged over public lands, there are invariably occupants and undocumented settlers who will stand to be displaced. And the tendency is that even if the investors start from generally unoccupied or barren areas, they will always expand to nearby areas that are privately owned. To get these properties, they will first try to sweet talk the owners into leasing their lands. A usual selling line in the Philippines is upfront payment of land rentals for the first 5 years, with promises of employment in the eventual business firm. If that does not work, then they will start employing different levels of persuasion, leading up to plain and simple harassment. There are stories, many stories in the Philippines of goons and rogue elements being let loose in a target area, sowing terror, setting fires, killing people here and there. So people start evacuating from their homes and their farms out of fear. And lo and behold, the agents of the firm will come to them and offer them help by telling them, take this money, 5-year rental upfront. This will help you. And of course, a lot of the farmers will have no choice but to give up their lands or lease it. And I think what is important to note here is it's not the investors per se doing it, but local people acting in behalf of the investors or for the investors, going into excesses in order to get the land for the investors. And usually local and national governments turning a blind eye on what is happening. So people start to ask why these foreign investors are able to get hold of large tracts of land while so many local people are landless, or will have to wait generations before they can get hold of even a small piece of land that they can call their own. And why small landowners and settlers who have struggled very hard to get their own land can be so easily dispossessed by such newcomers. This leads us to the case of policy inconsistency. I was talking to some Cambodian farmer leaders recently, and they told me they could not understand why the government on the one hand was encouraging them to protect and preserve forests and public lands, but at the same time was offering the same lands to foreign investors for conversion into large-scale plantations for very long periods, and even on a rent-free basis. No, it was free, being given free to investors. In the Philippines, the government has struggled very, very hard to implement a land reform program, but is now telling foreign investors to target the same land reform areas. Farmer organizations have raised fears that newly emancipated patents could end up becoming laborers on their own land, and the land reform program will revert into a land return scheme. Then there are, of course, the food security concerns. Many people ask why a country that is not able to feed its own population and has to import food from other countries is now allowing foreigners to use its own scarce land resources to produce things that cannot be eaten or food that will be exported out of the country. What is more important, rice or bananas, corn or jatropha? In many cases, you cannot say both because the plantations have to be contiguous and monocrop in order to have economies of scale. So farmers, and then later on local communities, and then later on maybe even the whole country can become a net buyer of food. Some would argue, then let us just buy the food from abroad using the money that we earn from the plantations. Ideally, that should be the case, but as the food crisis has taught many of us, it could be easier said than done. So are we willing to risk our food security in order to have these foreign investments? We should also consider that not all of the expected benefits from these farmland investments actually materialize, and that some of them involve costs that may offset the gains. Large-scale plantations, for example, employ very intensive cultivation practices that may lead to massive land degradation, water pollution, and long-term environmental damage. The application of inorganic fertilizers and inputs, deep plowing and radical recontouring of soils, and year-round planting could eventually render these lands barren and infertile by the time the lease contracts expire. In some areas of the Philippines, large-scale plantations have also been criticized for siphoning off scarce irrigation water away from rice areas. At the farmer level, there is the clear one-sidedness of many of the contracts by which the farmers and landowners ceded control over their lands. In most of the contracts, the landowners have practically no window for addressing their grievances. Some of the long-term lease contracts required the lessor, the farmers, to pay the investors for any permanent improvements that stay on the land at the time of the expiry of the lease contract, 30 years later. The lease agreements also effectively cede full control of the lands. The landowners who lease their properties to the companies cannot introduce any improvement, they cannot plant any crop, they cannot raise any animal on their own land without the express consent of the lessee firm. I don't know if they can even pee on their own land. Maybe that's also not allowed. No? The same is basically true even for the contract growers. It should also be considered that the shift towards contract growing in the Philippines, for example, is mainly an attempt by the plantations to evade labor laws and obligations by dealing with contract growers instead of direct employees. But in terms of farm control, it's practically the same as leasing. Finally, we can ask whether the farmers are better off leasing their lands instead of staying on as marginal farmers. Let us start with the rent, which usually ranges from $100 to $200 per hectare per year. Of course, it is paid 5 years in advance. But if you compute it, if a farmer leased 2 hectares, which is the average land area of a farmer in the Philippines, it amounts to only 50 cents or $1 a day in terms of rental income. I would think even a low technology farmer could easily generate as much, if not more, income per day from his own efforts on his 2-hectare farm. But I think the bigger issue is that by ceding his land, a farmer also cedes many of the opportunities and prospects that he could have enjoyed if he had continued farming and if his government had provided him more support. Now, without his land, he is just a worker on a farm beholden to his employers. Of course, there is the prospect of getting employment, but it is not an assured promise. He may be too old or his children may not qualify for work. And being business and profit-oriented entities, these companies will always try to find ways to cut costs, including labor costs. So, just by conclusion, I have some recommendations here. First, I think, as mentioned earlier, we need very clear rules with respect to foreign farmland investments in agriculture, which are consistent with national goals and policy thrusts. For me, these are more important than international codes of conduct, because who will complain to an international? The farmers will not be in a position to complain against a big multinational company in an international court. No? But maybe they could do that using local processes. Secondly, I think foreign investors must be told to strictly follow local rules, and countries should make sure that they do and punish them resolutely if they do not. Governments should also mean business. Third, and very important, there is a clear need to provide farmers and settlers some form of legal assistance when they deal with these agribusiness investors, so that they do not end with one-sided contractual agreements that tie them up and their families for generations. Together with this is a need for a system to protect their historical, ancestral, and legal rights over their properties. There's a very important need for these farmer lessees or lessors to organize themselves so that they can negotiate on an even more footing. One possibility is they could come in as co-investors in the business project, not just as lessors, but co-investors using their land as their equity and having a share in the profits of the venture. Finally, overseas farmland investments are not the cure to the problems of large masses of small farmers and landless rural workers in Asia. What is needed is for governments to do their homework by building the roads, putting up the irrigation, delivering health and education, and providing basic infrastructure and services that will allow the farmers to farm profitably and progress in life. And this government should give more recognition to their farmers and not pin all their hopes on foreign investors. Farmers are also investors. They may have very little to invest in terms of money, but they have the perseverance, hard work, and determination that has allowed them to survive all these years. And unlike foreign investors who can just as easily pack up and leave when things get bad, the farmers will continue investing and working on the land, if only because they have nowhere else to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. Offering an African perspective, our next speaker is Chido Makunike. He is an agricultural commodities exporter based in Dakar, Senegal. He partners with Agricole Afrique, a Senegal-based sustainable agriculture training center to supply dry hibiscus to a tea-making company in Germany. Mr. Makunike is also a freelance writer and an agricultural consultant. He also manages a blog, African Agriculture, and previously he coordinated the Africa office of the International Federation of Organic Agriculture and Movements.
Thank you very much, Sue. I looked at the agenda that Michael had prepared, and I sort of guessed that a lot of the points that I wanted to cover would have been covered by the very prestigious panelists that we already had here. So I decided to take a different tack with my presentation. I will not have a PowerPoint presentation. I have submitted a paper that will be available to anybody who wants to hear my thoughts or read my thoughts. But what I thought I would do would be just to give some different perspectives from what you've heard. And I think I'll start off with giving you a little bit of my background for you to understand exactly where I'm coming from. I'm an exporter. What I do is I buy this hibiscus. It's a type of a hibiscus that I'm not so sure is familiar to most of you. But it's a red hibiscus whose calyx is used for making a type of tea. You probably are familiar with it after all. That's very popular in Europe, and it grows very well in West Africa. It's also been traditionally grown in West Africa, so it's not an introduced crop. It does very well there, and it's very easy to grow. It's drought resistant. It's not susceptible to pests. So people have grown it in West Africa for generations for local consumption, for making juices, for making sauces, etc. So it's something that was very easy for the farmers to adapt to growing in much bigger quantities to export. But most of it for generations has been mainly used for local export. So what I have done is to put the farmers who have been growing this hibiscus for local consumption together with a foreign market that didn't exist for them before. And the foreign market was also looking for reliable suppliers. They mainly get their product from some trouble spots in Africa, and they've been anxious for years now to diversify their supply. So I'm the middleman who has been putting together two groups of people who have a need for each other. My background, I'm from Zimbabwe originally, so I'm not Senegalese, even though I'm based in Senegal now and have very deep roots in Senegal now. My own grandfather was a farmer of renown. He was a maize farmer. And he was one of the first farmers to take up so-called Western or European farming systems when they were introduced in the 20s and the 30s in Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia at that time. Intensive fertilizer use, a little bit of mechanization, etc., etc. He also was a very big cattle rancher in his time, so he was very well known. He was considered quite rich by the standards of that era. And then the laws changed during the colonial era. The number of cattle that you could have as an African farmer was severely reduced. The number of acres of land you could have was severely reduced, etc., etc. So all this land, a lot of it, and a lot of the cattle were just simply expropriated. Anyway, that's a brief background to some of the real difficulties that Zimbabwe is facing today, and I'm sure all of you have some familiarity with it. So up to this day, the family that got a lot of the land that belonged to my grandfather is now one of the most wealthy and most prominent families in Zimbabwe. Own hotels, own resorts, and so on and so forth. But they were given a lot of the cattle that was taken from my grandfather and a lot of the land that was taken from my grandfather, as well as the land of many other people, not just my grandfather's land. But they were given vast areas of land in this section of the country, similar in scope to some of the agribusiness deals that we're dealing with today. The consequences of those actions all over the country, and really all over Southern Africa, are with us today. And part of the reason that Zimbabwe is in so much trouble today, and part of the reason that the issues there are so difficult to resolve. I think the same sort of issues are coming up in South Africa, and we'll see how they will deal with them in the next several years and decades. So that's one issue. So now we have our own, we don't call them land grabs today, but now there's a lot of talk in Zimbabwe about land invasions, where politically connected groups of people are going into white farmers' well-developed farms to claim them under the guise of we're taking back our land that was taken from our fathers and our grandfathers and so on and so forth. It's cynical to some extent, and yes, the way it's being done is really quite ridiculous. But there's also a grain of truth in it, which is one of the reasons that it's such an intractable problem. That's one issue, the political difficulties that I fear are being repeated by a lot of these investors today. And Carl, hopefully, agribusiness consultants like you are helping to prevent some of these mistakes. But I'm amazed when I hear about how these investments are being structured, because it's exactly, from my perspective, the same mistakes that have been made over the last 200 centuries of African history. And this is one of the reasons that Africans are so suspicious and in many cases seem so irrationally opposed to some of these deals that on paper look like they would benefit them. It's because of this history that's not so far in the past. It's living history, which is why I mentioned my own family's involvement in this. My grandfather is dead now for 20 years and so on and so forth. But the memory of this is still very deep in our family. And the dispossession exists. So, I mean, we've recovered it and people move on. And this has happened to every group of people everywhere in the world. So it's nothing, really unique. But what I'm just saying is that it's not ancient history. It's living history that people remember today. And I'm amazed that investors don't educate themselves on these kinds of things. So it's not good enough to talk to me as a potential investor, if I was in potential, talk to me about the geopolitical risk and what are the profit margins and what's the productivity levels of the society, what's the entrepreneurial culture. That's important, definitely, but it's not enough. What's the history of land possession in this country? What's the political history? What's happened? What are the sentiments of the people? And I don't see this due diligence being done. So if you as an American investor based in Washington, D.C. wants to come and invest in my country, I'll tell you, you're welcome. This investment is needed. I think it's a good thing. I think I must say this up front. I think that the problem is the way it's been, the naive way it's being structured. So if you as a potential investor go to Carl, who you like, he's your neighbor, you speak the same language, you live in the same city, or at least in the same country, and you say, well, look, give me the risk factors for investing in country X in Africa. I say, that's fine, but he has no capacity to give you a full picture. No matter how thorough a job he does, he could spend months on the internet investigating this issue, but he doesn't know the sensibilities of the people. He cannot give you the perspective that a person like me can give you for free. Because it's in my family. It's in my family DNA. And this is exactly how these things are being structured. Well, maybe I'm just a radical, so-and-so here. But the failure of the South Korean deal in the last 2 months or so was, to me, so entirely predictable. When it fell through, I said, but how could it have gone any other way? Because what they have done is exactly the same mistakes that the colonialists did. And I'm not one of those people who say, oh, colonialism was all bad, it was no benefits, and so. That's not my point. My point was that the way it was done guaranteed that it was going to be a short-term project that would last 50 years, 100 years, whatever it was. But the resentment would build up until the people who you displaced had enough power to kick you off. And how can a sophisticated company like Dow, how could in 2008, 2009, do things exactly the same way that was done in the uninformed era of the 1850s, the 1600s? How? What kind of investment is that? I don't respect that kind of businessman. To me, that is lousy business. And yet we know Dow is a very successful company. My fridge is a Dow. I've seen a lot of cars, that are made because of Dow's investment. So these are not naive, foolish people. And yet they're making naive, foolish business decisions. That's my preamble. So I won't tell you how I ended up from Zimbabwe in southern Africa, Anglophone country, to Senegal in Western Africa, 4,000 kilometers away, Francophone country, and so forth. It's a long story, and it's not really relevant to what I'm here to talk about. But that's the situation that I'm in. I am now a businessman in Senegal, and I landed this contract to supply large quantities of this hibiscus to this company in Germany. And they said, we don't care how you get it, we don't care where you get it. If you can supply us the quantities that we want at this price, and these are our specifications, these are our quality standards, we'll be very happy. If you can do it for us. We don't care whether you grow it yourself, we don't care whether you buy it from other people. These are the specs. You must also meet the European importation standards, etc., etc. If you can do that, that's all we care about. So that was my challenge. So the difficulties were to find the money to buy this hibiscus from people. Knowing my history, I know that the history of these kinds of contracts, outgrower deals, is give us a product. The charming trader goes and sweet talks the farmers, give us a product, and then when I get paid for the product in 2 or 3 weeks or in a month and so on, forth, then I'll come and pay you. And this is the way a lot of these deals were structured. But you can well imagine there's so many things that can go wrong, many things that did go wrong. So I said, no, this is not what I want to do. I want to find the money, and I want to be very tough on the kind of hibiscus that I'll accept. But once you as a farmer satisfy my requirements, I will pay you cash on the spot. I said, we don't believe you. Not possible. C'est pas possible. We haven't seen this before. No. And where could somebody who looks like you don't wear a tie, you don't even look like a businessman? I said, if you can do this, this is my guarantee to you. Fair price, but extremely high quality standards, and I will pay you cash on the spot. So I ran around for 2 years trying to live up to my promise. Naturally being rejected by banks, by all kinds of people who just couldn't believe that this guy coming from 4,000 kilometers away, who doesn't even speak very good French, etc., could pull this off. That was my challenge. But I did that, and this is what I do. I have very stringent standards because my customer has very stringent standards. But once I inspect the hibiscus, I pay the customer, the farmers on the spot. When the farmers saw this, I had them. I said, this is my guarantee to you. I want a long-term relationship with you, and I'll treat you well, but I will be very tough on what I accept. So in investigating how to fulfill the requirement of my customer in Germany, I considered, the first thing I considered was growing it myself. And Senegal is very investor-friendly. You know, they want this investment. There are a lot of investors, mainly French or mainly European, who are growing all kinds of things for export back to Europe. So this is what I investigated. And coming from Zimbabwe, which is Western-style, sophisticated, high inputs type of, or had high inputs type of commercial agriculture, this was quite natural to me. I thought, this is the thing to do. I want to be able to control all my factors of production. I want to be able to control my labor. I want to be able to train them well, tell them exactly what I want. This is the way to do farming. This is what one, since dispossessed commercial farmers say to me in Zimbabwe many times ago, there is the African kind of farming, and then there's real farming. So I wanted to do real farming. I investigated all this over a good period of a year and so on and so forth. And to make a long story short, I decided, no, it was probably going to be a mistake for me to try to emulate this model of farming that was popular in Zimbabwe, that is popular in South Africa right now, and that all these other investors are talking about trying to implement in Africa. It's not a new thing. We've seen it before. I decided it was a mistake for me to do that. I was a foreigner. I didn't really understand the local culture, even though I was also African. I didn't really understand all the intricacies, and the more I investigated, the more I found out that, as several people have said to me already, technically, the land, a lot of the land, or all of it, belongs to the state. But that doesn't really mean all that much. The people you'll be interacting with are the local communities. And you find that when you dig a little bit deeper, there are land disputes going back generations that may be dormant. But once you come in, particularly as a foreigner, and you start telling people what to do, and you start making a lot of money, you start spending a lot of money, you start doing all kinds of things, then you start to bring them from under the surface to above the surface. And I don't think you can really win. And again, coming from Zimbabwe as I had done, I thought, I've seen how this scenario is played out in my own country. From one perspective, I don't want to make the same mistakes in a different country that were made to dispossess people like my grandfather. I want to do this right. And fortunately, I was lucky that I had a customer who also was committed to doing things right. They didn't want to just get the cheapest product under any conditions. They wanted to be sure that, okay, if you're going to do it this way, and they were skeptical about it as well. So we would prefer to know that you are growing it and you know exactly where it's coming from and you're growing it under our conditions. We're not really sure how you could have other people grow it for us. But I said, no, give me the time to work on it. And as long as you said to me, as long as I satisfy your requirements, specifications, you wouldn't care where it came from. So leave that to me. So that's what I did. I valued my own risk factors, and I decided, no, it was a little bit too risky for me in particular. Not because of Senegal or anything, but I thought, for me, I have not been in that society long enough. I don't understand all the factors. And then there were other more business-like things. I just would require massive amounts of capital to grow the hibiscus in the kind of quantities that would be required. It would be a 10-year project. I thought, this is a way that I can get started on a fairly small scale, but I can get started pretty much right away, because all I need is just the money to buy the hibiscus from the farmers. And I'm willing to pay high interest, whatever it is, because the turnaround time is about 2 or 3 months during the hibiscus season. Then as time goes on, I can expand it. I can do many other things. I can continue to have my outgrowers and have my own farm. So I'm speaking about this issue from personal perspective in terms of where I've come from in my own family, in my own country, and in terms of what I've investigated about what works in my own business. So I think some of the problems are incomplete understanding of what land means in Africa. And somebody here has alluded to it, but didn't go into enough depth. And I'm not going to do that here either, because we don't have enough time. But land isn't just a material economic resource in Africa. It's cultural, it's sentimental, it's also political. Land was one of the strongest symbols of African dispossession during the colonial era. And during the independence era, getting the land back was also one of the strongest symbols of we are now ruling ourselves again. And it's a long process. We haven't yet reached, in general, the stage where land is just like your car or your house. The value of it is just what the Blue Book says. Africa is in a state of transition from the old traditional indigenous ways of thinking to the new modern utilitarian sort of Western. Different parts of Africa at different stages of this transition. And you cannot ignore this if you are a smart investor. You ignore it at your own peril. And I think that many of today's large-scale agribusiness investors are imperiled because they ignore all this. It's not enough to go and talk to the minister and go and talk to the president of the country and make a deal with him. Presidents come and go, even in undemocratic country, one way or the other. So you risk, if you do deals in this kind of opaque way that mining and so many other things are done, but with land it's different, for reasons that I've tried to explain. When that president goes, or when that government goes, you cannot be sure that your investment is secure, no matter what title deal you have. These issues transcend those things, like we have seen in Zimbabwe, like we're beginning to see in South Africa, like we have seen in Madagascar. It's much more than just a legalistic issue, and it's not enough to limit your due diligence, your investigation of the investment prospect to that. And that's generally what somebody like Carl will be able to tell you, the economic factors, the business risks, the legal factors, and so on and so forth. But that's not enough. That's simply not enough. This brings me to the other issue, my other big problem about this issue, and somebody mentioned, I think our very first speaker, how there's been a raft of stories about this in the media in the last few months, in the last few weeks. But what is so interesting to me, especially in the African scenario, how few African voices there are. Even when people give the African perspective correctly, it's usually non-Africans speaking on behalf of Africans. And I think this is so wrong to me. It affects my sensibilities as an African who can speak for himself. But I think as an investor, it's just foolish. You as an African, you as an American investor or a European investor or Dubai investor, whatever, Chinese investor, propose to go and invest in a country you don't know anything about and you don't want to speak to the local people. I don't get it. I do not understand from a purely business perspective how that can make sense. Agriculture and farming are risky enough as it is. Why do you want to add to your risk like this? So I think these deals are potentially good, but I think that the way that they're being structured right now, not very smart for the investors. I think I took so long with my introduction. I've almost got to the end of my time. But I think that's about enough. I think that's about enough. I think those are the points that I want to make. I believe that these things are potentially good, but not necessarily good. All this talk about job creation, and we've seen all this before, we've heard all this before. It doesn't work the way that it's discussed. And I also don't understand why aren't people investigating Zimbabwe, which had this sophisticated kind of investment that we're now talking about introducing in countries, many of which have never had it before. What went right in the beginning? What went wrong? And one of the things, not the only one, one of the things that went wrong was inattention to the political and the social factors. So you can be very profitable, you can be a very good farmer in terms of how many tons of corn are you producing per hectare and so on and so forth. But if you ignore all these other areas, it doesn't matter how much you have your title deed. A lot of these dispossessed farmers in Zimbabwe still hold on to their title deeds wherever they are, in Washington, Australia, and so on and so forth. How much good is your title deed going to do you? And it's not just a matter of getting rid of one person, the president of the country, and putting in another person. The situation now has become so complicated that even if the person that you think is a problem died today, the solution to this mess that we have now is not simply to say, okay, whoever has a title deed, come back, we'll put you back on your farm or give you X million dollars in compensation. It's far more complicated than this because every side ignored the cultural issues, the social issues, the political issues that were festering for generations. And you do that today at your own peril. And which is a shame, because there is a potential here for these investors to make good money, but Africa also needs this kind of investment. It can be a win-win situation, but not the way that I generally see it being structured right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheeto. Our final speaker is Carl Atkin. He is the partner and head of research at Bidwell's Agribusiness in the United Kingdom, which is an international provider of consulting and management services to the farming, bioenergy, and agri-investment sectors. His team analyzes and interprets the implications of commodity market trends, global agricultural and environmental and rural policy on food and farming industries. And his consulting experience extends from the United Kingdom and Europe to the former Soviet Union and Africa.
Thank you very much, Sue. I've got the graveyard slot before lunch, so I'll try and keep it snappy because I know we want to have sandwiches and what have you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm slightly crumpled. I got separated from my bags somewhere across the Atlantic, so I had to go on a bit of a midnight shopping spree last night to make sure I wasn't here in my jeans and T-shirt. So, but anyway, very pleased to be here. Just to start off really by reinforcing actually what Cheeto said actually. If there's one thing you take away from my presentation today, I would say the absolute fundamental thing with all of these projects is who are the people on the ground that are going to make this work. There are hundreds of these so-called land funds, so-called farming companies, which I will come to when we talk about some examples, particularly in the former Soviet Union. They are populated with financiers and PR people, not by agriculturalists or by people who understand how to operate in transition economies, in my case. So the deployment and execution is everything. If I had money for every time I've seen a prospectus with some nice coloured graphs in where the wheat yield's going to go from 2 tonnes a hectare to 7 tonnes a hectare, the land area farmed is going to go up by 20,000 hectares every year, and the land improvement's going to happen. And I think, yeah, right, can this actually be done on the ground? So this is a very practical issue. Agriculture is a very management-intensive industry, and a lot of the timescales I think that people have put in those prospectuses are woefully unrealistic. Just again to pick up a point of Chido's here, land is a very emotive asset class. Yes, it's generic real estate to an extent, and we've heard this morning about the characteristics it has. It's an inflation hedge. The institutions like it in their portfolio because it's not correlated to residential or commercial real estate. It provides income, there's capital growth, there's all of these things, but it's also very emotive. In developed markets, there are lots of non-economic reasons that drive land prices. You know, in Western Europe, it's very driven by amenity and recreational value, by desire to own it for lifestyle purposes. In transition economies, because markets are often not developed at all, or only in their very embryonic stages, the usual value drivers don't apply. You know, and the price of land might be determined by example how well your village mayor can negotiate leases with a farming company who may be the only show in town, and they may know that they're the only show in town. So there are a whole range of very complicated drivers there that are affecting land and land values. What area am I going to talk about? Well, apologies for all of you Europhiles who know Europe backwards, but just to clarify, really, the investments tend to fall into two groups. Really, we're talking about all of the countries that pre-1989 were to the right of the Iron Curtain in the Warsaw Pact. Those countries that are now in the EU, and by that I mean the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, they're principally about agricultural real estate as a rule. There's often some limited exposure to operational farming, but in all those countries you can buy land, title to land is pretty robust, cadastral systems are fairly well developed in most of those countries, and the risk of freehold ownership is deemed to be pretty low. Skirting around Belarus, which is a little sort of black hole in the middle of Europe that probably goes somewhere alongside North Korea, the rest of the former Soviet Union, particularly Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, there we're really talking about operational farming. Yes, some of those entities have some real estate element to them, and we can talk about the challenges, particularly around land reform later, but that's really about operational farming, and we've seen a big play on the large farming companies, some of them privately owned, some of them quoted on various stock markets. But that's the distinction I want to draw, really, in terms of the two types of activity that's going on in this market. The drivers have been done to death. I won't go through them again. I thought these would have been well covered. Perhaps I would just make two very quick points. One on population. Yes, there's going to be 9 billion people by 2050. The population of Europe's actually going to have gone down by 9% by 2050. You know, the replacement rate in the Mediterranean countries is about 1.4 children per family at the minute. So I just say that point really to reinforce the need for a properly functioning global agri-trade system. Increasing the people are not going to be where the food's going to be produced. And that's pretty important, basic fundamental. The second one on the supply side is the land issue. David, I think it's an FAO statistic that there's something like 12% more farmland in the world, but then of course again there's a range of conflicting views about what's available for farmland. How do we balance that against biodiversity, against carbon sequestration capacity, against all of the other conflicting uses on land? But a lot of that land that's currently not cultivated or under-cultivated is in the geography I'm talking about today, particularly Russia being the obvious example, where there was large-scale collapse of organised agriculture post-1991-92. There's been a recovery in production, but there is still quite a lot of land not used to full potential. The other point, which again has been made this morning, but I'll just reinforce it because it is very important, is climate change. Europe and the former Soviet Union are pretty robust against climate change scenarios, at least in the short to medium term. And actually, parts of Russia benefit in the short term because what we generally see in the work by the IASA in Austria is that the production belt shifts northwards in the northern hemisphere. So actually, we see parts of Russia opened up. But we see Europe as being particularly well-proofed, both from a climate change and from a water resources perspective. Just to talk a little bit about investment activity, and again, I think the points have been made. Farmland and farming is a long-term game. You do not get in and out of these assets quickly. They're not liquid. You're looking at minimum 5 to 10 year investment horizons and probably longer. If you're into the short-term buck game, you're into commodities or you're into equities with high sector exposure, you know, the major fertilizer manufacturers, the major grain companies, the major life science companies. So whilst, yes, the food crisis of 2007-8 has accelerated interest in this area, we mustn't be led down the route that this is a short-term response to a short-term problem. Those who want to capitalise on the short-term peaks and troughs do it through other means. Those who believe that there is a long-term structural game to be played in terms of an investment opportunity, they're the people that are going for the real estate and the farming. Value chain's also worth a mention. If we look back historically at what's happened, most profitability at the farm level tends to go backwards and get capitalised into the land price, or it tends to leak up the value chain. So actually there might be more durable investment advantage by looking at vertical integration upstream as well as just in the operational business. Talk a little bit about long-term competitiveness. I've touched on this already, why we think Europe and former Soviet Union is a particularly good, I suppose, agroecological environment in which to invest. We've talked about the medium-term potential. I've got some soil data which is very similar to what we've seen earlier. Costs of production are pretty good. Cost to market, though, is one I just want to draw out, because that's the one that often is not really dwelt upon significantly. People, when they do very simplistic analysis around the world, tend to home in on areas where there are very low land costs, very low labour costs. But if there's no infrastructure and you physically can't get the stuff transported, and this is a big problem in parts of Africa and parts of South America, both within the country, and then there isn't a port that you can get it out of the country, and then where you are is a long way from where your market is, and again this is a particular problem with South America, then any production advantages may well be negated by logistics costs in terms of physically being able to do it and the cost of doing so. Yes, global freight rates have collapsed. The Baltic Dry Index is 20% of what it was 2 years ago. But even so, when you're looking at medium-term projections, you need to fully factor in sensitivity for transport costs as well as for production costs. This we've seen already, so I won't dwell on it, really just put it up to put the nice big belt of green soil going across into former Soviet Union, that black earth chernosem soil, which is really what's generated most of the activity in this region, in this area. Who's at it? Well, I just put a few examples up. Some of these are have been casualties of the global financial crisis, but certainly pre-September last year, all of these guys in one form or another were involved in agricultural real estate ventures in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of them have made it, some of them haven't. But they're a mixture there of products that were designed for retail investors, high net worth individuals, family offices and institutions. What we've generally seen in this space is that until relatively recently, this has been the space of the high net worth individuals and the family offices who are more interested on the long-term capital growth play. The institutions have only really got interested in the last 2, 3, 4 years. And the institutional problem that agriculture has is the income return is quite volatile and it tends to be quite low. And institutions, as a rule, like to have a running return. If they're pension funds or their life insurance companies, they need a running return on their investment. So that's one of the challenges of farming, as many of you will know. In the operational farming space, there are lots of people. Some of these guys have been around for a long time. Velcourt European Farming Company has been established over 40 years. Some of these are long-established former Soviet Union companies, Russian Farms, Astata Kiev. Some of these are relatively new. Black Earth Farming and Landcom were two in particular that some of you may have heard of, which were both quoted companies which began life about 24 months ago in Russia and Ukraine, respectively. So just talk a little bit about why all the investment interest. I've talked a little bit about returns and we've talked about farming structures already, I suppose. Again, depending on the type of investor, whether you're looking to farm in hand, whether you're looking to do some kind of joint venture or whether you're leasing, depends on what your investment strategy is. And it's very difficult to generalise because all of the investors are very different. One thing that's particularly interesting in Central and Eastern Europe is that since 2004 and the accession of the first wave of countries to the EU, they now operate their own simplified version of Common Agricultural Policy payments, so-called SAPS payments. Effectively, what that's done is to boost the profitability of agriculture in this region quite substantially. The payments have fed straight through to the bottom line, but as I've already mentioned, they were already feeding themselves into land occupancy costs and farmland prices, which are going up quite substantially. So from a sort of economic benefit point of view, that the same lesson applies in that often the operational farming business is not the one that captures the value from support. Support in Russia and Ukraine is quite complicated and is slightly different. There's been various things that have been tried over the years. Subsidised finance is the main mechanism in those two countries where effectively the government discounts the interest rate that you pay on debt, although again we're starting from fairly high rates of interest, so less clear there. Supply chain's a big issue, and I just talk about that because it's a threat, it's an opportunity. what we've seen in a lot of these countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, is a lack of supply chain capacity. So we've seen quite a lot of investment at farm level. We've seen a lot of investment at retail level. So if you go to places like Bucharest and Warsaw, you've got Walmart and Tesco and all of the major sort of Western chains are there. What's lacking is the supply chain infrastructure in the middle, particularly in terms of vegetable processing and packing, food processing, freezing, canning, etc. So that's a threat to those in the operational business in that there's a link in the chain missing, but it's also an opportunity in terms of, as I've already mentioned, there's an investment opportunity there. Just want to talk about some of the challenges now, because this is quite a complicated environment in which to operate, and probably one of the most defining factors of the former transition economies is how they've gone about land reform. Most of these countries operated either state-owned or collective-owned farming structures, or a combination of the two. So we were talking about relatively large scale but relatively inefficient by Western standards in terms of farming businesses. Usually what's happened post the early 90s is land has been restituted back either to the pre-1945 owners or more usually to the workers of the former collective or state farm. And effectively what that's meant is each individual or family has been given a parcel of somewhere between 1 and 4 hectares of land. Now, obviously, with hindsight, it probably wasn't very difficult to predict that what that caused was a massive collapse in agricultural output, because these businesses were not organised, they did not have access to capital, to expertise, and we saw a big drop in productivity in terms of land use and land use efficiency. Effectively, what happened was a lot of that land was immediately leased back to the former state farm that it originated from, but we did see a whole industry of household plots develop. We've talked about the land markets being imperfect in all of these countries. I've talked about title being complex. In Russia, it's particularly complicated because the land reform process was not fully completed down to the plot level, like, say, in Ukraine and Russia. A lot of the land is held in virtual land shares, so you might come to a field, say, of 20 hectares. You probably find that 20 people own it, but they can't identify their hectare in the field. Probably 2 of them have died, 3 of them have disappeared. You can probably trace 15 of them, so you can probably get title to 75% of the area, and then the other 25 either goes back into the state pool, or you're forever in a sort of long, drawn-out bureaucratic process trying to work that through the system. So the whole issue, don't underestimate the complications around land reform. Once title to land has been assured, there are quite a lot of complications. Tenancy law in some of these countries is very archaic. Certainly in Western Europe and the UK, farmland rents are set by reference to the market. Certainly not in these countries. They're often set by reference to archaic formula, which may be a long time out of date in terms of the productive capacity of the land. Land might be locked in corporates. This is a particular problem in East Germany, where effectively the former state farms in East Germany that were privatised, if you want the land, you have to buy the operating company because the land's locked inside it. And then some countries, particularly Poland, also Hungary, negotiated as part of their EU accession treaties quite complicated foreign ownership restrictions. In the case of the Poles, largely because they were worried the Germans were going to come and buy up vast tracts of the country when they acceded to the EU. So it's theoretically not allowed for a foreigner to own land in Poland until 2016, although there are workaround solutions. But just coming on to the point I started with, if you forget nothing else, if you forget everything else I said today, the absolutely fundamental thing, the challenge of operating in this environment is all about management and HR. Have you got the right people on the ground? Can they operate? Can they get things done? And that's a very interesting mix of skills. And again, there are a wide range of views amongst people in these environments about the relative split between Western management, in inverted commas, and local management, and where you draw the lines of responsibility. Clearly, you need somebody that has an understanding of the local operating environment, but if you've got somebody with a long legacy of coming up through the collective farm system, they probably don't have the financial and entrepreneurial nous to take those businesses forward. So structuring management teams is probably one of the most challenging things of operating in this environment. Just to give you a couple of examples, this is in northeastern Romania. This is near a town called Botoșani, where one of my colleagues is quite active doing some consulting work. You can basically see what I mean by land parcels. The village is on the right of the photo. Effectively, the land is stripped farmed, in inverted commas, almost, really, in terms of very small plots, relatively inefficient, relatively scattergun approach to agriculture. This is Western Ukraine. This is a company called Landcom, which is just outside Lviv, which I think actually that was where I was when Michael and I first started corresponding about whether I would come here, was in some dodgy hotel in the outback of Ukraine. But obviously this is a publicity stunt photo for the drill companies, it happens, but you get a feel from how the landscape has changed in terms of effectively 24, 30 months ago, this was very much a parcel-type landscape like we just saw in Romania on the previous slide. There are a lot of issues, and I probably haven't got time to go into all of them today, really, but I just pick up a number. One is, whilst the Western businesses and those businesses that have got Western capital are relatively well mechanised and relatively efficient, a lot of the former state and collective farms that are now operating as JSCs, joint stock companies, they suffer from outdated and inefficient equipment. This happens to be a farm on the top left, just outside Moscow, with a typical breakdown of harvester delaying activity. The bottom picture is also very important because one of the big issues for in these regions is lack of infrastructure. Soviet grain elevator, outdated, inefficient, probably run by somebody who's corrupt. Can you trust them if you put your grain in there that you're going to get the same amount out? So a lot of the businesses are having to internalise grain storage. Even though grain storage in itself is a low return activity, you probably need to control that because you need to control your market. Working capital, a lot of concern about output. The USDA figures, particularly for Russia-Ukraine, show quite a big drop in output this year because simply farmers can't access credit to buy fertiliser, either from normal clearing banks or from agricultural merchanting companies who have considerably reined back in their credit, given credit crunch, etc. Just to give you a feel, though, for what the play is here and why there's so much interest in these areas, and again, we can argue about these numbers because they're all relative and a lot of these markets are not well developed, but if we said farmland in Russia is probably worth, once it's fully parcelled and registered, somewhere around €500 or $500 for that matter per hectare. Land in the Central and Eastern Europe is within the EU is probably worth something like 2 or 3 times that. So in Romania, it's probably 2,000 to 3,000. In Western Europe, we're probably talking somewhere like UK, probably somewhere around €15,000 per hectare. So what's interesting is, even in the current crisis, although land prices have softened in many Western countries, the convergence that's going on between Western and Eastern Europe is overpowering that, and actually land prices in Eastern Europe continue to rise quite rapidly. Just make a quick point about valuation here of farming companies, and I suppose what many people have termed the agricultural.com, in that 18 or 24 months ago there was a huge amount of flurry of activity in this area. We saw farming companies that were listed, particularly some of the new listed companies, were trading at ridiculous multiples of EV over EBITDA, massive multipliers, bigger than we'd ever seen in history. I think what the last 18 or 24 months have shown us is that the projections in many of those business plans were wildly optimistic. As I've already mentioned, they're probably attainable in terms of yield uplift, in terms of land aggregation, in terms of farming improvement, but never over the timescales set out. And probably what was projected to take place in 2 or 3 years is more likely to take place in 5 or 10 years. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just whiz through this quite quickly just to point out a number of differences. I put up here the length of the growing season in Russia and Kazakhstan, just really to illustrate a number of things. One is Western Russia is where most of the interest is, and the green that stands out very boldly there is the Black Earth region south of Moscow that skirts down into Kiev. That is much more a typical European type of growing season. Wheat yields there can be 6, 7, 8 tonnes a hectare, which is really only 20 or 30% less than Western Europe. Kazakhstan, by extreme, you'll see how the length of the growing season is. They're actually planting wheat in Kazakhstan this week. I was talking to somebody out there, and a very short growing season. Wheat yields probably of a tonne a hectare of spring wheat. That's a tenth of what we would get in the eastern counties of England. So massively different agroecological constraints. And whilst there is potential to carry out yield uplift through technology and through management, fundamentally we can't move the soil, we can't move the weather, we can't move the climate. And I think a lot of people imposed overly ambitious Western European expectations on output into environments which are simply have got higher natural constraints. Just final slide to finish, I suppose, really, perhaps which is most interest to this audience today, the so-called impact of the land grab. And again, having spent quite a lot of time in Russia and Ukraine going around meeting various people, commercial operators, government, industry bodies, it really is very difficult to generalise because there is a very mixed view and mixed experiences of this. Generally, at regional government level, and I'm talking about sort of oblast governor level in Russia, there is generally a very positive reaction to foreign direct investment. Indeed, to some extent, there is competition to see which regions can attract most investment, and there is a certain degree of kudos that comes with having more tractors and more livestock in your region than in the neighbouring region. The government interaction with these companies is very important, and again, a lot of discussion with these companies about how they manage the relationship between themselves and with government. We do see to a limited extent pressure from government to adopt farming practices that might not be, in a totally commercial environment, be the ones they would choose. The obvious one is that investors tend to like broad-scale arable farming because it's low risk and requires less working capital. There is a pressure, particularly in Russia, to increase livestock production and have more meat and dairy capacity. There is also pressure to farm the land rather than land bank it. And again, I think a lot of the companies that got very big very quickly probably overextended themselves in terms of land area, and a lot of those companies are now divesting land to farm smaller areas and farm it better. The local community view is very mixed. What I would say is generally the companies, particularly the ones that are high profile, that have CSR policies and are accountable to Western investors, have to be seen to be doing the right thing, and that's very important. And the usual examples, as we've heard at length, giving money to schools, hospitals, providing ambulances, doing all these kind of services. What I think these companies don't do, and this is not particularly a fault of the new wave of investors, it's actually a fault of the collapse of the old centrally planned farm system, is they don't provide the wider social benefits that those state and collective farms that were not run purely commercially did. Those businesses provided a wider social role within rural areas that has collapsed in the sort of mid to late 1990s, in terms of providing old people with free food, providing lots of men and machinery in kind to mend the roads, all those kind of things which, there is a gulf there that is obvious in parts of rural Russia and Ukraine that gulf needs to be filled. What's the Western operator and investor view? Well, I've already mentioned a lot of these businesses got too big too quickly, and some of them are now consolidating. There was a massive grab for land over the last 12, 18, 24 months, and I think a lot of them have realised they would probably be better having less land and farming it better. So has the dot-com bubble burst? Well, I wouldn't say it's burst, but I think it's definitely retracted to a more manageable scale. And I'm a big proponent of activity in this sector. I think there's a lot of medium-term opportunities here, but I would just reinforce the point that everyone else has made. And again, as a pure sort of hard-nosed commercial person here, I strongly endorse everything that's been said. The way that this is executed, sensitivities to local engagement, understanding the operating environment, taking time to meet with all of the relevant people at local, regional and national government level, understanding how to manage those relationships is the absolutely fundamental thing. We can all sit here in a room in London or Washington or New York and draw lines on maps, as was mentioned, and do Excel spreadsheets till we're blue in the face with yield projections. But if we don't go and see on the ground what's happening and really take the time and trouble to make these work, then these ventures won't work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Right now we are going to open up the floor to Q&A. Please wait for Justine and Jacqueline to hand you the mics, and identify yourself and your affiliation when I call on you. So who has questions? Okay. Front row on the left.
Dan Kazmar, I'm a research associate with the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. Mr. Atkin, can you say something about the interaction between Russian demographics, especially rural, and agricultural development? I'm thinking particularly about Siberian development. If there's, what the possibilities are, what the interaction is there.
Well, I'll preface this by saying Siberia is not a region I know well, so forgive me, but I'll make some general comments, if that's all right, I think that there are obviously a number of issues here. One is that the rural population in both Russia and Ukraine is generally elderly, because the common demographic trend we see is a migration of younger and skilled people as a rule to centres of urban population, particularly Kiev and Russia. So to some extent there is a ticking time bomb in terms of the increasingly elderly rural population. Indeed, it's been suggested to me, and again I welcome counterview, that one of the reasons for the moratorium on land sales in Ukraine is that the government's concerned that if the rural elderly poor sell their land for next to nothing too quickly, they will lose their annual income payment from leasing, and the government will have to pick up the social cost of caring for all these elderly rural poor people. So I think that in itself is a problem. Is that in itself a problem that's accelerated by Western investment? It may be, but also it's a problem that is existing anyway, because even the existing businesses that are there, that are increasing, the former Sovkhozs and Kovkhozs that are becoming more commercial, the reality is they are having to shed labour, and they are having to do more with less. And so to some extent, as I think has been made by some of the earlier commentators, maintaining inefficient agriculture to maintain high levels of employment is not a sustainable model in the medium term. But what's needed is other rural development around that to transform opportunities for some of those other people. I'm not a rural development specialist, so I'd be interested. I see some nodding in the audience whether anyone's got any sort of counter views, but that would be my view.
Hi, my name is David Johnson. I'm with Drell Solutions. My question is about the model happening in Afghanistan right now with the Taliban prepaying farmers to grow poppies. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility, like if you guys could offer some insight into how investment might change the way they do business.
Does anyone want to take this?
I'll attempt to. I'm not familiar with that model, and I can imagine the farmers being very happy about that. But I don't, from my experience, my perspective, I don't see that really catching on. There are too many things that can go wrong. Just like farmers are used to traders who have taken advantage of them by taking their crops and promising to come and pay them when they have been paid and then disappearing. There are also situations where farmers don't do what they promised to do for the trader or for their partners. Somebody comes along after the farmer has spent the money and before they've delivered the poppy. Somebody comes along and offers them a higher price than what you agreed on. And they're tempted to just to sell it because they're generally poor farmers and they're generally also honorable people, but there's some who aren't. And there are lots of cases in Africa, and I'm sure many other places where traders have got burnt because they've given not so much prepayment, but other kinds of support on the understanding that that will be deducted from the price when you finish the deal, and you never finish the deal because the farmers go and do something else, or attempt to do something else, either by unscrupulous other trader or some other kind of pressure. So I doubt that. I don't know any of the details, but I don't see that really taking off very much anyway.
I again don't know anything about poppy farming, I have to say, but just two general points, I suppose. On the first one on risk management, I think one of the slides I skipped over was agriculture and farming is inherently risky for all of the natural reasons of weather and productivity as well as price and etc. So from a risk management point of view, with my consultant hat on, I will say it would be sensible to underpin a proportion of revenues as far in advance as possible. However, there are lots of practical problems with that. One is that in many of these transition and emerging economies, we don't have the same suite of risk management tools that we have here in the West. So, in the Western environment, farmers can have forward contracts, they can have futures and options, they can have fixed price contracts, all of these kind of things. They're simply not available in these kinds of environments. The second issue is in a relatively stable environment like Western Europe, you can be pretty assured to within 10 or 20% what your crop output's going to be, because A disastrous crop of wheat in the UK is 7 tonnes a hectare, a good one's 10 tonne. A disastrous crop of wheat in Eastern Europe is there's no tonnes because it's died in the field, as happened in Romania 2 years ago because there was no water. So I think the volatility of operating, and again, a good point from an investor point of view, investors, when they're selling you their investment prospectus, particularly if they're the company looking to investors, they will quote the 2-year and 10 wheat or oilseed rape yield in their prospectus and go, hang on, is that an average? Is that a 5-year and 10? Yes, some of these environments, 2 years and 10 will do comparable to Western Europe standards, but in other years there may be little or no crop at all.
If I can just add one last thing. My experience in Africa in general, my own personal experience, but from studying these issues, is that relations matter a lot more or perhaps in a different way than they do here. Where here, the most important thing is for you to have a contract and for you to have the protection of the law. But in many of these countries where the law is weak or very difficult to enforce, I suggest and propose to these prospective investors that you do your investment in a way that you get the people on your side. Not only the government. You cannot afford the government. The government is important, obviously. But that you get the people on your side rather than against you. And a lot of that is building relationships. So I think a lot of the enforcement that we've been talking about here should come from the investors seeing it as to their own business benefit to have good relations with these people. Then they'll do what they say they do because they see it's in their own interest. They will protect your own, they'll protect your company because they can see how their livelihoods are going to be improved by your investment. But again, very often people just think, well, no, we pay off the minister or whatever it is, we get our title deeds and we're covered. And I don't think that's generally the way it works in most countries, probably most countries outside the Western world.
In the back of the room.
I'm Arinamda with the Compliance Advisor and Ombudsman for the World Bank Group, the private sector IFC and MEGA. I just wanted to raise a couple of comments and questions about this issue. I pick up on your point of relationships and the importance of relationships. In some of the work that we've done, we've responded to complaints from local landholders in Indonesia in relation to palm oil and the rapid growth and encroachment of palm oil into traditionally held lands. We've been successful over the last year in terms of helping some communities to renegotiate contracts with foreign investors that were supported by the bank group and come to amicable settlements over those parcels of land. It's a small example, but it is a case where the point that was made earlier that perhaps international codes aren't enforceable, I think we've come with some examples of where having a code of practice was, with an opportunity for recourse and remedy, allowed communities to reach out and access the type of remedy that they wanted. But I come back to this point about, and my question, which is about relationships. We found it extremely important to try to level some of the power imbalances that were talked about in the first panel. The investor comes with a set of power, the local people come with other power. The local authorities often see a very strong incentive to offer contracts to foreign investors and sometimes bid against other local authorities to do so. Do the panel members have examples of, across the wide range of experience that you have, of host government systems that have been supportive of the types of relationships, the types of depth of engagement that I think you're all saying we need to see in order to promote positive investment? So that's my question.
Well, in the Philippines, I think because of the past experiences with very one-sided contracts, the government agencies now are a little bit more careful. They are still inviting the investors, but they are very sensitive to local sentiments and trying to find something that can please both sides. again, in the Philippines, we have a very different situation because of our land reform law. The beneficiaries of the land reform program cannot sell their lands. They cannot lease their lands technically, legally. So how can they tie up now with investors? And some of the things they are thinking about is small landowners coming in as co-investors in the agribusiness firm. And then they would also share both ownership and also profit in those firms. But whether an investor is willing to go to that extent is another question. But definitely the old system of giving the land to the investor and then just letting the people take care of themselves, that wouldn't do now. There would be so much backlash against that kind of style that I don't think even government agencies will let that happen now. So in a sense, it's improving. But in many cases, the contracts are still with individual farmers, the lease contracts. So that needs to have some overriding regulation from the national government and, if necessary, an international code of conduct to protect those types of small farmers.
I would say that's not really an ideal area for government intervention. I don't think government would handle the question of direct relationship between the investors and the farmers very well. Governments are under-resourced, they're busy doing too many other things, and many of those other things they don't do very well. They just don't have the money, they don't have the capacity. I, as an investor, want the minimum involvement with the government. I cannot avoid the government, and I want certain documents when I export and so on and so forth. I want that kind of support from the government. But I don't really want too much interference from the government. Now, you could say, well, you know, perhaps it's because I'm inclined to exploit my farmers. But I think you would find in many situations, there are exceptions, I'm sure, many situations the farmers and many other people in the chain would be quite happy not to have government interference, because governments in many countries are not facilitators like we would like them to be, but they are actually even more inclined to slow you down because of inefficiency, because of corruption and many other things. So I think, like Raul has said, the ideal role for government is to set the right framework that is investor-friendly, but that also protects the farmers. Have a good framework in place that's also enforceable, so that when something goes wrong, if the investor then exploits the farmers, then it can, the government machinery can then kick in if necessary. But I think the ideal situation is for the government to play its role as a provider of the overall framework, and then ideally get out of the way.
Do you have examples? Senegal?
Yes, I think so. I think this is basically the way they work. They try to attract investment. They have a lot of limitations, so you know there are many other places that are more attractive. But they try very hard. I think so. Yes. But I'm also very familiar with how, after they have done that initial effort, the actual process of doing business, the actual process of me exporting after I bought my product from the farmers, me actually exporting it is very difficult. There are a lot of things that don't work the way they would work in Washington. So I have to climb mountains to do some very simple things. But that's part of why it's called the developing world, and so you just sort of must accept that. And that's one other thing that I would say to an investor. I mean, you should just. I think a lot of what's required to be a successful investor in places like Africa, and I'm sure a lot of the same applies to other continents, is a paradigm shift. You just must accept before you go that yes, there is great potential here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be even investigating it. But what's required to realize that potential is a very different way of thinking and a very different way of doing business. And again, I'm not so sure that I see a full realization of this when I read about these deals.
Just a quick one, very practical issue about engagement with government. This is something that came up a lot during my my last visit in Russia, and I won't name names, but there are two sort of opposing schools of thought. One is that you must have a government official on your board or in your pocket to get anything done. The other school of thought is, don't pay a government official who's corrupt, because once you pay him, you'll be forever paying him and you'll never get anything done. The conclusion I came away with, unsurprisingly, was that probably the middle road viewpoint is the right one, which is you have to be empathetic with government, you have to take the time to go and meet them, understand them, tick all the boxes in terms of genuinely engaging, understanding what their concerns are, accommodating with them. But you don't want to get embroiled with anything that's underhand, because you are on a slippery slope there that you will never retract yourself from. So there's a sort of sensible engagement level somewhere along that spectrum that in terms of the challenges of operating this country, because it is very bureaucratic. In all these former century planned economies, to get anything done, there are endless agencies and forms to fill in, and quite simply, things can just get bogged down, and you can be waiting for years for things to happen if you've upset the wrong people or not gone about things the right way. So it is very important not to try and steamroll your way through and try and take shortcuts, be it land registration, be it planning for grain silos or whatever. But you've got to steer a very robust middle course and not get embroiled in a lot of nonsense.
Let me just do that. My suspicion also is a lot of the excesses are done by local people who are acting in behalf of the investors. They go through, I think they overdo it sometimes, or that's my suspicion. I don't know, for example, who drafted contracts that were very one-sided, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was done by local people who wanted to please the investors, or show them that they can do things, and they went overboard to some extent. So their governments are also important, because these are local people who can be put under local laws.
More questions? Okay. Please.
Just another example, and I'd have to point you to people at UNDP to follow up on this, but at first I sort of thought I disagreed with Chito about the role of government, but then my two examples probably reinforce that, and that's the contrast between Mozambique and Tanzania. And it's largely from what attitude the government is taking in its policy toward the investor vis-a-vis the locals. As I understand it, Mozambican land law still gives high recognition of customary tenure and says that any foreign investor must negotiate this with the local community. Now, obviously, for that to be effective, there's probably going to need to be some kind of assistance for many local communities in terms of their negotiating capacity, and where that comes from is a question. As opposed to Tanzania, which requires that each community land plan set aside a certain amount of land for investment, and then communities that can't come up with that investment themselves, that want to invite in foreign investment, they actually have to, they cannot rent that directly, they have to reassign that land to the state, which then does the negotiation. And so the communities actually lose out in that process. In that case, I mean, there were cases of South African investment coming in for biofuels, for example, which were basically taking the land away from the local community. So those are two cases you might want to look into more detail.
All right. I guess I'll use this opportunity to ask one of my own questions. I think my question is mainly, maybe it's for Chito, just out of curiosity. I was just wondering, in the long run, would the current level of overseas farmland investments affect the amount of foreign aid that comes, through ODA to Africa? Like, do you have any thoughts on that? And if the rest of you have any comments, please.
I would be surprised if it did, because I think that foreign aid and these investment deals are from such different players and such different ways of thinking, even. I find that I worked in a development organization for a year, so I also have experience to the NGO sort of world. And I find that generally speaking, again there are exceptions, there is strong instinctive opposition to these kinds of foreign deals, and that has to do with a lot of ideological factors. The type of farming, they're opposed to this intensive kind of farming. And that's another thing we haven't had time to get into here, this is another related discussion. These big investments necessarily deal with intensive chemical intensive farming, which a lot of people are opposed to. They say it's bad for the earth, it's bad for the soil, Africa doesn't need this, it's not appropriate for Africa, and so on and so forth. That's another whole discussion that's lurking in the background that affects all this. So they would say, well, look, and these people are profit driven, they just want to make money and so forth, and there are problems with this. So I think that these people occupy really different mental worlds. So I don't really see one affecting the other anyway in the near term. I think they'll be totally different sort of streams. Yes. But again, one of the ways that I think that this is necessary, I think that the aid model of donor projects, NGOs coming to do things for Africa and so forth, that is really old, and that's one of the things that drove me to look for a business opportunity and to want to work with small-scale farmers to show. And I think this is another related benefit. These people have the confidence of knowing that they're producing this crop for me, yes, but they know it's ending up in Germany, and they're doing it entirely of their own efforts. And the driver there is a good price that I'm paying them, and the guarantee that if they can deliver the quality, I'm paying them cash. And there are not many other cash crops that are available to these farmers. So here's an example of development, quote unquote, but it's entirely internal and it's entirely commercial, it's business-like. And I think there's a lot of discussion now about that's where Africa really needs to go. This model of just aid and donors and so on and so forth. It's getting a little bit tired. And there are a lot of Africans who are, who don't find it so admirable or attractive anymore. Yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, and prefacing this, I'm not a development specialist by any means, but I am involved with advising a project, an agricultural advisory project called Africa Invest, which is a commercial investment project in Malawi, which aims to combine large-scale commercial farming with small-scale smallholder agriculture. And one of the big positive outcomes of that is exactly as Chido said, in terms of trying to close the dependency gap. If you look at levels of aid that have gone into those countries versus GDP growth, we've seen a massive gulf. And again, I'm not a development specialist, but the development experts on the team tell me that actually the private sector capital that we're putting into a project like that, or they're putting into a project like that, I should say, actually could be considerably more effective than the straightforward NGO aid type model, which of course will not go, which will hopefully be complemented. But this is really going to empower people to actually create markets and create employment and create activity, and effectively complement aid monies.
I wouldn't be surprised if ODA is part of the bigger deal. And I think for some countries they would try to be as courteous as possible to foreign investors, hoping that the governments of these investors will be able to give them some assistance later on, or maybe it could be part of the assistance, like you could have a foreign investor that would need port facilities or roads for its operations, but that would be official development assistance is given in the form of ODA to support indirectly the foreign venture, but at the same time make it look like ODA for local people. So those kinds of deals wouldn't be very surprising to me, or that kind of thinking.
Bob?
I'm Bob Hathaway. It's my good fortune to run the Asia program here at the Wilson Center, and since it's time for us to adjourn, I simply want to say that I found both of these panels today exceedingly rich, exceedingly informative. Many of our speakers traveled long distance at considerable inconvenience to themselves to be with us, and this program simply wouldn't have been nearly as good without their participation. So I just want to echo the thanks we've already heard to all 7 of our panelists. In addition, I have to confess that when Michael and Sue brought this idea to me some months ago, I didn't fully appreciate its importance. But I did have the good sense simply to say, okay, do it, and then stay out of their way. And I would like everyone in this room to join me in a round of applause, not only for our 7 panelists, but also for Michael and Sue, for really what I think has been a very, very stimulating and good morning. So join me, if you will, in thanking all 9 of the people responsible for this today.